In 1916, while Europe was tearing itself apart in the trenches of World War I, an American heir was building something that cost more money than most people would see in 1,000 lifetimes. James Deering spent $26 million building a single house in Miami, Florida. That's over $800 million in today's money, more than the cost of building 15 Walmart supercenters, more than what most Fortune 500 CEOs make in their entire careers. But here's what nobody tells you about VIZCAYA. The man who built it barely lived there. He spent less than 9 winters in the mansion that was supposed to immortalize his name, and the empire that paid for every marble column, every European painting, every hand-carved door. That empire doesn't exist anymore. International Harvester, once the largest agricultural machinery company in the world, controlling 90% of America's farm equipment market, broke apart and disappeared, sold off in pieces, gone, finished. Yet the mansion still stands, perfectly preserved, open to the public. 300,000 visitors walk through those doors every year, staring at the wealth that was meant to prove American industry could rival European aristocracy. They photograph the gardens, they marvel at the artwork, they post on Instagram about old money and luxury. And nobody's talking about what really happened here. This isn't a story about success. It's a story about what happens when you build monuments to power that's already crumbling beneath your feet. And here's what no one's talking about. James Deering knew his empire was dying while he was still building his palace. He just didn't want to admit it. If you're ready to see what really happened when ambition collided with reality, when industrial dominance met its expiration date, when a mansion outlasted the system that created it, let's begin. Now, let's look at where this money actually came from. Because you need to understand the scale of what created VIZCAYA to understand why its existence tells us everything about how empires fall. The Deering family fortune started with Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper in the 1830s. That invention changed American agriculture forever. Before McCormick, harvesting an acre of grain took a dozen men with scythes working all day. After McCormick, one man with a reaper could do it in an hour. Think about that multiplication of power. Think about what happens when you can harvest 12 times faster than your competitors. William Deering saw the opportunity and bought into the business. By the 1870s, he'd built the Deering Harvester Company into McCormick's biggest rival. The two companies spent decades trying to destroy each other. Price wars, patent fights, dealership battles. They were bleeding money trying to dominate the market. Then J.P. Morgan stepped in. In 1902, Morgan orchestrated a merger that created International Harvester Company. McCormick Harvester, Deering Harvester, and 3 smaller competitors all combined into one massive trust. It was the largest agricultural equipment manufacturer on Earth. They controlled 85% of America's harvesting machinery market. Farmers had no choice. You bought from International Harvester or you didn't harvest grain. The Deering family became one of the wealthiest in America overnight. Not Rockefeller wealthy, but close. James Deering, William's son, was now an executive in a company that had a complete stranglehold on American agriculture. And here's the critical detail everyone misses. This monopoly made the Deerings wealthy, but it also made them vulnerable. Because when you control that much of a market, everyone wants to break you apart. Labor unions, politicians, competing industrialists, they all had International Harvester in their crosshairs. James Deering was 53 years old in 1912 when he started planning VIZCAYA. He was already sick. Pernicious anemia was slowly killing him. His doctors told him to move to Florida to live in sunshine and warmth. But that wasn't the real reason he built VIZCAYA. The real reason was that James Deering needed proof that American industrial wealth could match European aristocracy. He needed to show the world that a man from Maine could build something as grand as a Venetian palazzo. That American money deserved the same respect as centuries-old European dynasties. This wasn't about comfort. This was about legacy, about proving dominance. So he bought 180 acres of mangrove swamp on Biscayne Bay. He hired a team of designers who'd studied at the finest art schools in Paris. He traveled Europe for years, buying furniture, artwork, architectural elements, anything that screamed old-world prestige. He stripped Cuban estates for their limestone. He imported Italian craftsmen. He employed 1,000 workers in a city that only had 10,000 residents. 10% of Miami's entire population was building one man's house. Let that sink in. One man's winter home required 10% of the city's workforce. Construction began in 1914, the same year World War I started. James Deering was building a fantasy of European grandeur at the exact moment Europe was destroying itself. Now, let's look at what actually went into VIZCAYA, because the details reveal something important about the psychology of wealth at its peak. The main house sprawls across 45,000 square feet. That's bigger than most hotels. 54 rooms, 34 of them decorated with European antiques and artwork spanning 5 centuries. Every room designed to tell you that the owner had unlimited money and impeccable taste. Paul Chalfin, the interior designer, spent years combing through Europe's auction houses and private collections. He wasn't buying mass-produced furniture. He was buying pieces that came from Italian villas and French chateaux. Real history, real aristocracy. Bringing it to Florida and installing it in a brand new mansion that was supposed to feel centuries old. The architecture was inspired by Villa Rezzonico in the Veneto region of Italy, designed by Baldassare Longhena in the 1600s. Deering wanted everyone who saw VIZCAYA to immediately think of Italian Renaissance grandeur, of power, of permanence. The gardens were even more elaborate. 10 acres of formal Italian gardens with fountains, sculptures, grottos, secret paths. Diego Suarez, the landscape architect, created something that had never existed before. Italian Renaissance design adapted to subtropical Florida. Classical European aesthetics with tropical plants. Controlled elegance in a place that naturally wanted to be wild jungle. They built an entire village on the property just to house the workers who maintained the estate. 12 acres, 11 buildings. VIZCAYA was designed to be completely self-sufficient, its own farm, its own power generation, its own workforce living on site, a private kingdom. James Deering moved into the main house on Christmas Day, 1916. After 8 years of construction, 8 years for a winter home, he arrived on his yacht, the Nepenthe. Because of course he had a yacht. Actually, he owned 3 yachts. He loved sailing. He hosted regattas. He competed against Carl Fisher, the developer who built Miami Beach, and beat him using Fisher's own boat. That's the kind of flex we're talking about. Winning a race against the boat's owner using his own vessel. But here's what nobody mentions. James Deering was already dying when he first slept in VIZCAYA. His health was failing before the house was even finished. The pernicious anemia was progressing. The Florida sunshine wasn't curing him. The warm climate wasn't reversing his condition. The entire premise of VIZCAYA as a health retreat was already proven false. And construction kept going anyway. The gardens weren't finished until 1923. 7 years after he moved in. 7 more years of spending money on a property he couldn't fully enjoy because he was too sick to appreciate it. $26 million total. Over $800 million in today's money. For less than 9 full winters of use. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what was happening to the empire that was paying for all of this. Here's the part nobody talks about. While James Deering was building VIZCAYA, International Harvester was already showing signs of terminal weakness. World War I disrupted everything. Global trade routes collapsed. Steel prices skyrocketed. Labor became scarce as men went to fight in Europe. International Harvester's supply chains were in chaos. More importantly, the war changed how people thought about monopolies. When the government needed to mobilize the economy for war production, they realized how vulnerable America was to companies that controlled entire industries. What happens if International Harvester stops making equipment during a food crisis? What leverage do monopolies have during national emergencies? The question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was strategic. It was about national security. Labor unions were getting stronger too. The industrial workers of the world and the American Federation of Labor were organizing massive strikes. Workers in Chicago, where International Harvester had its headquarters, were demanding better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. International Harvester had always been able to crush labor organizing in the past, but now the political climate was shifting. And then there was the competition. John Deere wasn't just catching up, they were innovating faster. While International Harvester was focused on maintaining its monopoly through market dominance and dealership control, John Deere was focused on building better tractors, simpler, more reliable, easier to repair, farmers noticed. By the early 1920s, International Harvester's market share was slipping. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably, steadily. The kind of decline that looks small in quarterly reports but compounds over decades. James Deering spent the winter of 1923 at VIZCAYA, watching his gardens finally reach completion. The estate was perfect. Every detail finished, every vision realized. It had taken more than a decade and consumed more money than most people would earn in 100 lifetimes. And he barely had the strength to walk through it. The anemia was winning. His doctors told him to rest, to avoid stress, to accept that he was dying. He traveled anyway. He went to Europe in 1925, against medical advice, probably trying to recapture something, trying to prove he still had vitality, trying to deny what was obvious to everyone around him. On September 21, 1925, James Deering suffered a heart attack on the steamship City of Paris while returning from Europe. He died at sea, never made it back to America, never saw VIZCAYA again. He was 65 years old. He'd spent less than 9 winters in the house that cost $26 million to build. He never married, never had children. His only heir to VIZCAYA were his nieces through his half-brother Charles. And here's the question nobody asks. If James Deering had known he only had 9 years to enjoy VIZCAYA, would he have spent $26 million building it? Would he have poured $800 million in today's money into a monument he barely got to experience? The answer tells you everything about how wealth thinks at its peak. The mansion wasn't really for James Deering. It was for the idea of James Deering. It was proof that he mattered, that his wealth meant something, that he could build something that would outlast him. And it did. But not in the way he imagined. Just 1 year after James Deering died, VIZCAYA faced its first real test. And this is where the metaphor becomes almost too perfect. September 18, 1926. A Category 4 hurricane slammed into Miami with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The Great Miami Hurricane, one of the most destructive storms in American history at that time. Miami's population had exploded during the Florida land boom of the early 20s. The city had swelled from 10,000 people in 1910 to over 100,000 by 1926. Most of these new residents had never experienced a hurricane. They had no idea what was coming. The storm hit at night. The wind speed was so intense that the Weather Bureau's anemometer broke at 128 miles per hour, meaning the actual wind speed was probably closer to 150. Storm surge reached 11 feet above mean high tide. Water from the Atlantic Ocean crossed Miami Beach completely and flooded into the city of Miami several blocks inland. 4,700 homes were completely destroyed. 9,000 more were severely damaged. The Red Cross reported 372 deaths, but the real number was probably higher. Many bodies were never recovered. Thousands of people were injured. At least 25,000 people were left homeless. The economic damage was catastrophic. $105 million in 1926 money. That's over $164 billion in today's dollars. More than Hurricane Katrina when adjusted for inflation. More than any storm America had experienced before. The Florida land boom ended instantly. The real estate speculation that had driven Miami's growth evaporated overnight. Banks collapsed. Developers went bankrupt. Construction stopped. The city that had been building mansions and hotels and golf courses suddenly couldn't afford to rebuild basic infrastructure. And VIZCAYA. VIZCAYA survived, damaged but still standing. The main house lost some roof tiles. The gardens were devastated, trees uprooted, sculptures toppled. The carefully manicured landscape turned into a debris field, but the stone villa itself endured. The symbolism is almost too obvious. The mansion built on industrial empire wealth survived the storm that destroyed the city built on speculative gambling. Solid wealth versus paper wealth, real assets versus financial bubbles. Except, here's the twist. Both were doomed. The difference was just timing. The 1926 hurricane destroyed Miami's economy, but the Great Depression destroyed International Harvester's dominance. The stock market crashed in October 1929. The agricultural sector collapsed almost immediately. Farmers couldn't afford to buy new equipment. Banks foreclosed on farms across the Midwest. The Dust Bowl started in 1933, turning millions of acres of farmland into desert. International Harvester's sales plummeted. Farmers who did survive weren't buying new tractors from an expensive monopoly. They were buying used equipment. They were buying from smaller companies that offered better prices and easier financing. They were buying from John Deere, which had positioned itself as the farmer-friendly alternative to International Harvester's corporate dominance. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that International Harvester had built its business model around controlling the market, not serving it. They'd spent decades crushing competition instead of innovating. They'd focused on dealership networks and market share instead of building the best possible equipment. When the market contracted, all of that corporate bloat became a liability. International Harvester had massive factories, enormous overhead, complex supply chains, and a workforce that expected high wages. John Deere was leaner, more efficient, more innovative. When farmers had to choose where to spend their limited money, they increasingly chose Deere. International Harvester's market leadership eroded throughout the 1930s. They were still huge, still profitable. But the trajectory had changed. The monopoly was ending. And once you lose that kind of market dominance, you almost never get it back. Meanwhile, VIZCAYA sat empty most of the year. James Deering's nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson, inherited the estate. Neither of them wanted to live there. The house was too big, too expensive to maintain, too impractical for anyone who wasn't trying to prove something about industrial wealth. The operating costs were astronomical. Dozens of staff members just to maintain the building and gardens, constant repairs, hurricane damage, saltwater corrosion from being right on Biscayne Bay. The subtropical climate that made VIZCAYA so beautiful also made it incredibly expensive to preserve. The nieces started selling off the outer parcels of land, first a few acres here and there, then larger sections. By 1945, they sold a huge portion of the property to the Catholic Diocese for Mercy Hospital. Then, more parcels for development. The estate that was once 180 acres was being dismembered, piece by piece. By 1952, only 50 acres remained. The main house, the formal gardens, and the village. Everything else was gone, sold to pay for the maintenance of what was left. And here's the detail that should shock everyone. In 1952, Miami-Dade County bought what remained of VIZCAYA for $1 million. $1 million for an estate that cost $26 million to build just 36 years earlier. That's a 96% loss in value. Think about that. The mansion that was supposed to prove the permanence of industrial wealth lost almost all its value in one generation, faster than stocks, faster than bonds, faster than almost any other asset class you could imagine. Why? Because nobody wanted to live in a monument to someone else's ego. Nobody wanted to pay the operating costs of a 54-room villa that required a full-time staff. Nobody wanted to maintain Italian gardens in subtropical Florida. The mansion that James Deering built to immortalize himself became worthless the moment it stopped representing active power. The only way VIZCAYA survived was by becoming public property. A museum, an artifact, a reminder of wealth that no longer existed. Now let's fast forward to what happened to International Harvester, because this is where the story gets really brutal. By the 1970s, International Harvester was in serious trouble. They'd been gradually losing market share to John Deere for decades. Their profit margins were thinner than their competitors. They'd expanded into trucks and construction equipment, trying to diversify, but those divisions weren't profitable enough to offset the declining farm equipment business. In 1978, they were still near the top of the Fortune 500, one of America's largest companies. but the fundamentals were rotting from within. Then came the perfect storm. Literally. Not a weather storm, but an economic hurricane. In 1979, International Harvesters United Auto Workers Union called a strike. It lasted 172 days, 5 months, one of the longest strikes in UAW history. Production stopped completely. Dealers couldn't get equipment. Farmers bought from competitors. The revenue loss was catastrophic. At the same time, inflation exploded. Interest rates soared. The Federal Reserve was fighting inflation by crushing the economy. Farmers stopped buying equipment completely. The agricultural sector entered a severe recession. International Harvester lost $500 million in 6 months. $500 million. In 1979 dollars, that's over $2 billion in today's money. One of the biggest corporate losses in American history at that time. They tried to recover. They brought in Xerox executive Archie McCardle as CEO, the first outsider to run the company in its history. He was supposed to turn everything around, revitalize the sleeping giant. Instead, he made it worse. McCardle tried to modernize too fast, spent billions on new plants and technology without understanding what farmers actually wanted, took on more debt, tried to force labor concessions that triggered more strikes. The company was hemorrhaging money and losing customers simultaneously. John Deere was eating their market share. Caterpillar was dominating construction equipment. International Harvester was being outcompeted in every market they operated in. By 1982, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. They sold the construction equipment division to Dresser Industries just to stay afloat. Then, in 1984, they finalized a deal to sell the agricultural equipment division to Tenneco, which merged it with Case Corporation. International Harvester no longer made agricultural equipment. The core business that had built the empire was gone. Sold to a competitor, absorbed, erased. The company reorganized as Navistar International in 1986, focusing only on trucks and engines. But that wasn't really International Harvester anymore. That was just a shell company keeping the name alive. The empire that paid for VIZCAYA had completely collapsed, broken apart, sold off in pieces. The Deering family's ownership and influence were gone. The monopoly that once controlled 85% of America's agricultural machinery market didn't exist anymore. And here's the kicker. Navistar itself eventually failed as an independent company. Volkswagen bought it in 2021. A German company absorbed what was left of one of America's greatest industrial empires, from monopoly to foreign acquisition in less than 120 years. That's how fast empires die. Now, here's the part that should disturb everyone. There are at least 7 reasons why this story isn't widely discussed, and every one of them reveals something about how we think about wealth today. Reason 1. Admitting that VIZCAYA represents failure contradicts the narrative. We want to believe that grand estates are trophies of success. We visit them, we photograph them, we post them on social media with hashtags about luxury and old money. Recognizing that VIZCAYA actually represents the last gasp of a dying empire ruins the aesthetic. Nobody wants to take Instagram photos in a monument to industrial collapse. Reason 2. The preservation community needs to justify maintaining these properties. VIZCAYA costs millions of dollars per year to preserve. Miami-Dade County has spent over $50 million on restoration just in the last 2 decades. How do you justify that spending if you admit the mansion symbolizes excess and waste? You can't. So the story becomes about cultural heritage and architectural significance instead of about what VIZCAYA actually represents. Reason 3. Wealthy people don't want the cautionary tale. Anyone with significant wealth looks at VIZCAYA and sees a possible future. What if their empire also collapses? What if their children sell everything to pay maintenance costs? What if their monuments become public museums because nobody else wants them? These aren't comfortable thoughts. So the story gets reframed as tragedy rather than inevitability. Reason 4. The industrial decline isn't dramatic enough. International Harvester didn't collapse in a spectacular explosion. It eroded slowly over decades. Market share loss, profit margin compression, labor problems, debt accumulation. These are boring. They don't make good stories. But they're how most empires actually die. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, and nobody wants to hear that version. Reason 5. Acknowledging the pattern would indict current wealth. If VIZCAYA represents a mansion that outlasted its empire, what does that say about contemporary billionaire estates? About the mega yachts and private islands and sky-high penthouses being built today? The pattern is identical. Building monuments to prove dominance while the systems creating that wealth are already showing cracks. But pointing this out would be impolite, possibly career-limiting for anyone in positions that depend on wealthy donors. Reason 6. The real lesson is about the temporary nature of all industrial wealth. John Deere beat International Harvester. Then, other companies will eventually beat John Deere. No company maintains monopoly power forever. All industrial empires eventually fragment under competition, regulation, or technological disruption. VIZCAYA survived because it was made of stone and marble. International Harvester didn't survive because market dominance doesn't have the same permanence as architecture. But accepting this means accepting that your own wealth, your own company, your own empire will also eventually end. Most people would rather not think about that. Reason 7. The comparison to today's wealth is too obvious. When you look at VIZCAYA and then look at the mansions being built in Miami right now by tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, the parallel is uncomfortable. They're doing exactly what James Deering did, building monuments to prove dominance, spending hundreds of millions on single properties, importing the finest materials, hiring the best designers, creating private estates that require armies of staff to maintain. And the tech industry? The finance industry? They're showing the same warning signs International Harvester showed in the 1920s. Monopoly power being challenged by regulation and competition. Business models built on market dominance rather than sustainable innovation. Labor organizing, political pressure. The foundation cracking while the monuments keep getting bigger. Nobody wants to say this out loud because the people with enough platform to say it are usually dependent on the wealth they'd be criticizing. But the pattern is there, clear as day, visible to anyone willing to look. Let me show you how this pattern plays out in the present. Because VIZCAYA isn't just history, it's a template that keeps repeating. Athletes build multi-million-dollar compounds at the peak of their earning years. Then, their careers end. Injuries, age, the money stops flowing. The mansion becomes impossible to maintain. They sell at a loss or the bank forecloses. The monument that was supposed to prove they'd made it becomes evidence they didn't understand how wealth actually works. Entrepreneurs sell companies for 9 figures and immediately buy trophy homes. Not because they need the space, because they need the signal. They need everyone to know they've succeeded. 5 years later, the mansion sits empty most of the year because they're busy building the next company. 10 years later, they're selling at a significant discount because maintaining a 30,000 square foot house requires more money and attention than anyone wants to admit. Lottery winners are the perfect example. The average lottery winner who buys a mega mansion goes bankrupt within 5 years, not because they ran out of money, but because they spent it on assets that consumed more than they generated. The mansion doesn't create value. It destroys value. Every month, every year, maintenance, property taxes, insurance, staff, utilities, security, the costs never stop. And unless you have income that exceeds those costs indefinitely, the mansion eventually eats everything. This is what happened to VIZCAYA. James Deering's wealth came from International Harvester. When International Harvester stopped dominating the market, when the profit margins compressed, when the empire fractured, the flow of money that could maintain VIZCAYA stopped. His heirs tried for 27 years. Then they gave up and sold it for $1 million. The same pattern plays out with corporate headquarters. WeWork built lavish offices and premium real estate as a signal of dominance. Then their business model collapsed and they couldn't fill the space. Enron built a trophy tower in Houston as proof they were an energy giant. Then fraud was exposed and the building became a monument to failure. The architecture outlasts the empire every time. Here's what almost nobody understands. Display destroys wealth. Savings build it. James Deering spent $26 million on a house he used for less than 9 winters. What if he'd taken that same money and invested it in bonds, in diversified stocks, in building a family trust that could compound for generations? The Rockefeller family did exactly that. They built trusts and foundations, they diversified, they prioritized preservation over display. Today there are over 200 Rockefeller descendants sharing a fortune worth over $10 billion. The Vanderbilt family did what James Deering did. They built monuments. The Breakers in Newport, Biltmore in North Carolina, massive estates that required fortunes to maintain. Within 50 years of Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, the family fortune was largely gone. Spent on maintenance, sold off in pieces, Anderson Cooper, a Vanderbilt descendant, inherited essentially nothing. The monuments remained. The wealth evaporated. This is the choice every generation of wealth faces. You can build monuments that signal dominance and slowly consume your capital. Or you can build systems that preserve and compound wealth across generations. Most people choose the monuments because monuments are visible. They prove you've won. They show everyone you've succeeded. But monuments outlast empires, and when the empire collapses, the monument becomes a museum, evidence of excess rather than success. Let's do the math. Let's add up what James Deering actually spent versus what happened to that wealth. VIZCAYA cost $26 million to build between 1914 and 1923. That's over $800 million in today's money, for a house used less than 9 winters, for a property that sold to Miami-Dade County for $1 million just 27 years later. Total wealth destruction, $25 million, 96% of the initial investment, gone. In less than 3 decades. But let's calculate what that same money could have done if invested differently. $26 million invested in bonds in 1914 at an average real return of 3% per year would have grown to over $60 million by 1952. Even accounting for the Great Depression, even with all the economic chaos of those decades, $26 million invested in diversified stocks would have done even better. The stock market returned an average of 6% real annual returns from 1914 to 1952 despite the Depression. That same capital would have grown to over $130 million. $26 million put into a family trust structure like the Rockefellers used, with professional management and strategic diversification, that could have compounded into billions by today. Instead, James Deering's heirs sold VIZCAYA for $1 million. That's the quantifiable cost of building monuments. But the real cost is harder to measure. Because wealth isn't just about numbers. It's about options. It's about security. It's about what your children and grandchildren can do with the capital you preserve or destroy. James Deering died childless. His nieces inherited a mansion they couldn't afford to keep. They spent 27 years trying to maintain it, selling off land parcels one by one, watching the empire their family built disintegrate around them. Then they gave up and took a 96% loss just to be free of the burden. What options did that leave their descendants? What security? What foundation for future generations? None. The Deering family name is attached to a museum in Miami that 300,000 tourists visit every year. That's the legacy. Not wealth, not opportunity, not security for descendants, just a building that someone else owns and maintains. Here's the final irony. VIZCAYA survived precisely because it failed. If James Deering had successfully created a dynasty that maintained the estate for generations, VIZCAYA would have been modified, updated, changed to fit contemporary tastes. The integrity of the original design would have been compromised by each generation's need to make it their own. But because the family couldn't afford to keep it, because they sold it to the county as a museum almost immediately, VIZCAYA was preserved exactly as James Deering built it. The 1916 design frozen in time. Maintained by professional curators who prioritized historical accuracy over personal preference. The mansion survived its empire by becoming a museum before the empire completely collapsed. If International Harvester had remained dominant, if the Diring family had maintained its wealth, VIZCAYA might have been torn down or completely rebuilt in the 1960s or 70s. But because the money ran out early, the structure survived. Stone and marble outlasted steel and machinery. Architecture outlasted industry. The monument outlasted the empire, but not in a way anyone intended. VIZCAYA stands today as something James Deering never imagined, not as proof of dominance, not as a signal of aristocratic wealth, but as evidence. Evidence that building monuments is different from building wealth. Evidence that display and preservation are opposite strategies. Evidence that the things meant to last forever often outlive the reasons they were created. 300,000 people visit VIZCAYA every year. They walk through the rooms, they photograph the gardens, they marvel at the opulence, and they learn about James Deering, the industrial heir who built a palace he barely got to enjoy. They learn about International Harvester, the monopoly that no longer exists. They learn about the Gilded Age, when American industrial wealth tried to rival European aristocracy and mostly failed. What they don't usually learn is the real lesson. That VIZCAYA's survival isn't a success story. It's a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you prioritize display over substance, when you build monuments instead of systems, when you try to prove dominance instead of ensuring continuity. The mansion survived, but everything it was supposed to represent didn't. The empire collapsed, the family scattered, the purpose disappeared. Only the stone remained. So here's what you need to understand. Display destroys wealth. Savings build it. James Deering spent $800 million in today's dollars building a house he used for less than 9 years. His heirs sold it for a 96% loss just 27 years later. International Harvester, the empire that paid for every marble column and European painting, broke apart and ceased to exist. The Deering family wealth evaporated. The dynasty ended. But the mansion still stands. Perfect, preserved, a monument that outlasted its empire by becoming a museum. Total wealth destroyed, $25 million in historical dollars, over $750 million in today's money. Gone, spent on display instead of invested in systems, consumed by maintenance instead of compounded by diversification. And nobody's talking about this because the lesson is uncomfortable. We want to believe that grand estates represent success. We want monuments to mean dominance. We want to photograph luxury and dream about old money. We don't want to admit that VIZCAYA represents the opposite, that it's evidence of excess, proof that even the greatest empires collapse. A warning that stone and marble often last longer than the power that built them. The pattern repeats today. Tech billionaires building compounds in Silicon Valley. Hedge fund managers buying penthouses in Manhattan, athletes constructing mega mansions in Miami, entrepreneurs spending fortunes on trophy estates, all of them following the exact same path James Deering walked, building monuments to prove they've won, spending on display instead of investing in preservation, creating maintenance burdens their descendants won't be able to afford. Some of those estates will survive. Most will be sold at losses. Some will become museums. Most will be demolished. But all of them will eventually stop representing active wealth and start representing historical excess. Because that's what happens when you build monuments instead of systems. The stone outlasts the empire. The architecture outlasts the industry. The mansion survives. The dominance doesn't. VIZCAYA stands today not as a triumph, but as evidence. Evidence that even the greatest empires collapse, and that stone and marble often last longer than power. And nobody's talking about this because admitting it would force us to question every monument being built right now, every estate, every display of dominance, every signal of success that's actually a burden in disguise. But the pattern is there, clear as day, for anyone willing to see it.